Leave her alone.
Look at her.
The sun was merciless that afternoon, spilling its harsh light over the dusty roadside market. The air was heavy with the smell of spices, roasted corn, and sweat. Vendors shouted to draw customers, children darted between stalls, and carts creaked under the weight of fresh produce. It was a place of constant movement, where survival was bartered for a few coins. At the far corner, where the dirt road met the cracked cement, sat a girl who seemed invisible to most. Amina, 14 years old. Her clothes faded from too many washes, her sandals worn so thin they barely held together. In front of her rested a small basket filled with oranges, bright and round, yet far too few to attract much attention. Her thin fingers clutched the basket's edge as if the fruit inside was her only shield against the world. Every morning she came here, and every evening she left with fewer coins than she hoped for. Still, she returned, because this was her only chance at keeping her family alive. But the market was not kind to her. A group of schoolboys in neat pressed uniforms passed by. They laughed loudly, pointing at her basket. "Look at the poor orange girl," one of them sneered, his voice carrying just enough for her to hear. "Does she think she'll ever sell those rotten things?" Their laughter echoed as they disappeared into the crowd. Amina's chest tightened, but she kept her eyes low. She had learned long ago that answering back only made it worse. Quiet resilience had become her armor, though cracks showed in the corners of her tired eyes. Moments later, a well-dressed woman in gold bangles slowed near her basket. For a heartbeat, Amina's heart lifted. But the woman wrinkled her nose. "Ugh, these are so small. Who would waste money on this?" she muttered, before walking away. Amina lowered her head further, wishing the earth would swallow her. Every rejection, every insult pressed down on her small shoulders, making the basket feel heavier than it truly was. Yet she stayed rooted in her spot, whispering silent prayers that someone, anyone, would show her kindness. The world around her bustled, but she was alone in her corner, invisible until mocked, unseen unless humiliated. Still, she did not give up. When flies landed on the oranges, she brushed them off carefully, polishing each fruit with the edge of her scarf. She tried to arrange them neatly, as though order and beauty could convince someone of their worth. Deep inside, she knew these oranges carried more than just juice. They carried the weight of her survival, her mother's medicine, and her family's fragile hope. Yet all the world seemed to see was a poor girl with a basket too small to matter. And so the day dragged on, filled with laughter that wasn't hers, insults that cut deeper than she let anyone know, and a silence that screamed louder than any shout. But life has a way of turning when least expected. For in the midst of cruelty and dust, the first seeds of change were already stirring, though Amina did not yet know it. Behind Amina's quiet eyes lived a story few cared to know. To the people who mocked her, she was only the orange girl, but her life had been shaped by storms far heavier than their laughter. Her father had once been the strength of their small household. He was a simple man, hard-working, with hands rough from labor. Amina still remembered his smile when he returned home with bread, or when he carried her on his shoulders after a long day. But fate had not spared him. A sudden illness swept him away when Amina was only 12. One moment, he was full of life. The next, their home echoed with silence too deep for a child to bear. His death left a hole in their family, and an even bigger hole in their survival. Her mother, already frail, sank deeper into sickness. Coughs rattled her chest at night, and her body weakened day by day. Medicines were too expensive, and neighbors who once greeted them with respect began to turn away, unwilling to be burdened by their troubles. So, at the age when other girls still dreamed of school books and games, Amina stepped into the role of provider. She dropped out of school, the chalk and notebooks replaced by baskets and street dust. Her classmates moved forward in life, chasing lessons and laughter, while she sat on the roadside hoping to trade fruit for coins. Every morning, she rose before the sun, washing her mother's face with a soft cloth, whispering promises that today she would sell enough for food and medicine. Then she carried her small basket of oranges to the market. The load was light compared to her father's burdens, but it weighed on her like the world itself. Sometimes, when she saw children her age rushing to school in their neat uniforms, her heart burned. She wanted to be among them. She wanted to sit in a classroom again, raise her hand and chase her dreams. But she swallowed those desires, burying them deep beneath her duty. One day, she told herself, maybe one day. The cruelty of others, however, made that hope harder to hold. Even her neighbors, people who once shared meals with her family, now whispered about her. She's wasting her time, some said. She'll never be more than a roadside seller, others laughed. Those words pierced sharper than knives. Yet, Amina carried herself with quiet dignity. She had no choice but to endure. For her mother's sake, she could not afford to collapse beneath the weight of their judgment. Still, the pain showed in small cracks. At night, when her mother finally fell asleep, Amina allowed herself to cry softly, muffling her sobs into the corner of her thin blanket. She longed for her father's guiding hand, for a life where she could be a child again. Instead, she bore the scars of responsibility too heavy for her young shoulders. But somewhere within that burden lived a fire. Every day she rose again. Every insult she swallowed, every rejection she faced, became another stone in the wall of her resilience. She would not break. Not yet. And though she did not know it, fate had already taken notice. Beyond the dust, beyond the market, her path was slowly curving toward someone who would change everything. For now, all she could do was survive, with her oranges, her tears hidden in the night, and a heart that refused to give up. The market was a battlefield, and every day Amina stepped into it armed with nothing but her basket of oranges and fragile hope. From sunrise to sunset, she sat on the roadside calling out softly to passers-by. Her voice often drowned beneath the shouts of other vendors. Men with louder voices, bigger stalls, and fresher goods. The sun scorched her skin until her scarf clung to her forehead with sweat. Dust from cartwheels and footsteps coated her clothes, turning her once bright scarf dull. She shifted often on the rough ground, her legs aching from hours of sitting still, her stomach growling when the few coins she earned weren't enough for food. Some days, no one bought at all. The oranges, once plump and glowing, grew softer under the relentless heat, their skins wrinkled, their scent turning sour. She watched with dread as they spoiled before her eyes, knowing each ruined fruit meant less money for medicine, less hope for her mother. But hunger and heat were not the worst of it. The cruelty of people cut deeper. A group of young men strolled past one afternoon, pretending to show interest. One picked up an orange, tossing it lightly in his hand. "How much?" he asked with a smirk. "10 rupees, sir," Amina replied quietly. He whistled and laughed. 10? For this tiny thing? I'll give you 2. His friends roared with laughter, mocking her voice, her worn clothes. Then, with a careless flick, he threw the orange back into the basket, bruising the fruit. They walked away without paying, their laughter echoing like cruel music in her ears. Others treated her as though she wasn't even human. Some knocked her basket accidentally on purpose, sending oranges rolling into the dust. When she scrambled to pick them up, they sneered, "Be quicker next time, orange girl." No one stood up for her. No one told them to stop. In that crowded marketplace, surrounded by noise and people, Amina might as well have been invisible. The only time anyone noticed her was when they wanted to mock her. At times, she felt like a shadow. She watched the women bargaining for gold jewelry, the children tugging at their mothers for sweets, the men boasting about business deals. All of them moved past her, as if she was just part of the dirt beneath their shoes. Her heart often whispered the question she dared not speak aloud. Was this all she was meant to be? A girl mocked for her poverty, trapped in a cycle that would never break? And yet she endured. Each insult weighed heavy, but she refused to crumble. She polished the bruised oranges with her scarf, arranged them neatly again, and forced herself to lift her head. Cars passed by on the road behind her. Shiny, expensive vehicles that kicked up clouds of dust as they sped toward better parts of town. Their tinted windows reflected the sun, hiding the faces inside. To Amina, those cars were symbols of a world forever out of reach. People of wealth and power drove past her corner every day, their engines loud, their eyes blind to the girl by the roadside. But as the hours stretched and the dust swirled, a strange thought began to grow in her heart. What if one day one of them stopped? The idea seemed foolish, almost laughable. Why would anyone in such a car ever notice a poor girl with a basket of oranges? And yet, the thought lingered like a whisper of fate, soft but insistent. For now, reality was harsh and unchanging. But change has a way of arriving quietly, just when hope seems thinnest. The day had dragged on like so many before it. Long, hot, and cruel. Amina's throat was dry from calling out to buyers who never came, and her arms ached from clutching her basket. The market around her buzzed with life, but for her, time felt frozen in despair. She had begun to lose hope when an old woman shuffled toward her. Her steps were slow, her back bent, her hands trembling slightly as she leaned on a wooden cane. Unlike the others, she didn't wrinkle her nose or sneer as she approached Amina's basket. She stopped, her cloudy eyes scanning the small pile of fruit. "How much for these, child?" the woman asked, her voice thin but kind. Amina blinked, startled. Kindness was so rare that it almost felt foreign. 10 rupees, ma'am," she said softly, her voice uncertain. The woman smiled faintly. She reached into her small purse and pulled out a few coins, placing them carefully in Amina's hand. Then, without bargaining, without complaint, she picked 2 oranges from the basket. Her fingers brushed Amina's hand, warm and fragile, and she said quietly, "You remind me of someone I once loved." The words were simple, but to Amina, they felt like sunlight breaking through a storm. Her throat tightened, and tears pricked her eyes. She forced herself to smile, but her heart swelled with emotions she could barely hold back. It wasn't about the sale. It was about being seen, spoken to with respect, treated as more than just a poor orange girl. The old woman gave her a gentle nod and moved away. Disappearing into the crowd as quietly as she had come, Amina stared down at the coins in her palm. Her fingers trembled as she closed them tightly, holding on not just to the money, but to the warmth of that moment. She realized how starved she had been, not for food, but for kindness. For the first time in a long while, her heart felt a little lighter, and as she lifted her head, brushing a tear from her cheek, something unusual caught her eye. On the road beyond the market, a sleek black car slowed down. Unlike the others that sped past without a glance, this one lingered. Its engine purred softly, and the tinted window seemed to glimmer in the sunlight. Her breath caught in her chest. Someone was watching, and in that instant, without knowing why, she felt the air shift around her, as though her life was about to change. The black car rolled to a stop at the edge of the market, its polished body gleaming under the sun. Conversations around Amina faltered as people turned to stare. Cars like this did not belong in this dusty, forgotten corner of town. They belonged to the wealthy, the powerful, people who never slowed down for anyone like her. Yet here it was. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man in his late 30s. His presence drew every eye. He was tall, well-dressed in a crisp suit that seemed untouched by the dust swirling in the air. A silver watch gleamed on his wrist, and his polished shoes clicked sharply against the ground. But it was not his clothes that held Amina's attention. It was his face. He carried an air of quiet strength, but there was something else too, something unspoken. His eyes, deep and searching, seemed to carry shadows. A weight of memories lived behind them, as though he had known pain of his own. The market fell into whispers. Who is he? Why is he here? Do you think he's lost? Amina's heart thudded in her chest. The man's gaze swept across the crowd, then settled on her. For a moment she froze, gripping her basket tightly. People like him never looked at girls like her. Yet now, he was walking straight toward her corner. Her throat went dry as his shadow fell across her basket of oranges. How much for all of them? He asked, his voice calm, gentle, and yet carrying a firmness that demanded respect. The words stunned her. No one had ever asked to buy all her oranges. Usually, people haggled for the smallest, cheapest one, mocking her for daring to charge at all. Sir, all of them? She stammered, unsure she had heard him correctly. He gave a slight nod. Yes, every single one. Amina swallowed hard. She whispered the total price, her voice barely audible. She expected him to frown, to argue, to throw back a cruel remark the way others always did. But instead, he reached into his wallet and pulled out crisp bills. Far more than she had asked for. He handed them to her without hesitation. Keep the change. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eyes widened, mouths dropped open. The same people who mocked her every day now watched in disbelief. Why her? Someone whispered. She must be lucky, another muttered, envy in their tone. Amina's hands trembled as she accepted the money. Her mind raced. No one had ever treated her like this. No one had looked past her ragged clothes, her worn sandals, and seen her with dignity. Her lips parted, but words refused to come. Gratitude, confusion, fear, all swirled in her chest. She wanted to ask him why. Why stop for her? Why care when so many others had turned away? The man bent slightly, studying her face with an intensity that made her heart flutter uneasily. He didn't look at her with pity, but with recognition, as though he saw something in her that others ignored. "What's your name?" he asked softly. For a moment, she hesitated. No one had asked her that in so long. To the world, she was just the orange girl. But she found her voice. "Amina," she whispered. His lips curved into the faintest smile, though his eyes remained somber. "Amina, it suits you." Then, without another word, he picked up the basket himself and handed it to his driver. The act was simple, yet it spoke volumes. He treated her fruit with care, not disdain. As he turned to leave, the market buzzed louder. Some looked jealous, others curious, but all were shocked. For the first time, Amina was not the subject of ridicule. She was the center of wonder. She clutched the money in her hand, still trembling, her heart pounding as though it might burst. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she had not known in years. Someone had finally seen her, not as a poor roadside girl, not as a target for mockery, but as a human being worthy of respect. And though she did not yet understand why, she knew this moment was the beginning of something that would change her life forever. That evening, after the market began to thin and the dust settled into a quiet haze, Amina remained in her corner. She still clutched the notes in her hand, unable to believe they were real. Never before had so much money passed through her fingers. But what stayed with her even more than the bills was the look in the stranger's eyes. Steady, searching, filled with something unspoken. She thought he had gone, vanishing back into the world of wealth and power he belonged to. Yet, as the final vendors packed their goods, she noticed the black car parked again at the edge of the road. The same man stepped out, his suit jacket now removed, sleeves rolled up. He walked with purpose, but also with a strange softness, as though careful not to frighten her. Amina's heart hammered. She had no reason to trust him. Men who noticed girls like her often had cruel intentions. She rose instinctively, her basket hugged tightly against her chest, ready to run. But then he spoke. "You looked frightened when I left earlier," he said, his voice low and even. "I didn't want to leave you with more fear than you already carry." Something in his tone disarmed her. It wasn't pity. It wasn't arrogance. It was sincerity. Still cautious, she asked, "Why did you buy my oranges?" "No one ever does." For a moment, he didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the ground, as though gathering courage. Then he looked at her again, his expression heavy with memory. "Because once, a long time ago, I knew someone who stood in a place just like this. Selling fruit, mocked, forgotten. And I was too late to help them." His words settled like stones in her chest. There was grief in his voice, grief that had never healed. "Who was it?" she asked softly, curiosity overpowering fear. He inhaled deeply. "My sister. She sold fruit on the roadside while I chased dreams of success. I told myself I'd come back for her, but life kept pulling me away. When I returned, she was gone. Poverty consumed her, and I never forgave myself." Amina felt her throat tighten. In his story, she saw a reflection of her own pain, her own battles. For the first time, she realized the man's act of kindness wasn't random. It was personal. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken understanding. The invisible threads of two wounded souls brushing against each other. Finally, Amina spoke, her voice trembling. "People laugh at me every day. They call me names. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever escape this life, or if I'll disappear like your sister." Her confession surprised even herself. She had never spoken her fears aloud before, not to her brother, not to her neighbors. Yet with this stranger, the words flowed like water breaking through a dam. The man's eyes softened. He stepped closer, though keeping a respectful distance. "You are stronger than you know, Amina. You've endured more than most could bear. Don't ever think you are invisible. I saw you today, and I promise you, your life will not disappear into the shadows." His words struck deep. She felt warmth rise in her chest, mixed with tears she could no longer hold back. For so long, she had prayed for someone, anyone, to see her, to tell her she mattered. And now, here was this man, a stranger, yet somehow carrying the voice of hope she thought she had lost. She wiped her cheeks quickly, embarrassed, but he only gave her a gentle nod, as though granting her dignity rather than shame. After a pause, he asked quietly, "Do you go to school?" Amina shook her head. "I had to leave after my mother died. My brother and I, we survive on what I sell." The man's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with a storm she could not name. Then he placed his hand inside his coat pocket and pulled out a small business card. He held it out to her. "Take this. If you ever need help, real help, not just money, come find me." Her fingers trembled as she accepted the card. She glanced at the name, though she barely understood the titles written there. What she did know was that it felt heavy with possibility. As the evening deepened and stars began to appear, the man finally returned to his car. He gave her one last look, steady, meaningful. Before the door closed and the black vehicle disappeared into the night. Amina stood alone under the dim glow of the streetlight, the card pressed against her chest. The sound of his words echoed in her mind, wrapping around her heart like a fragile promise. For the first time in years, she dared to believe her story wasn't over. Something had shifted. A door had opened. And though she didn't know where it led, she felt a spark of hope flickering in the darkness. That night, Amina could hardly sleep. She lay awake on the thin mat she shared with her younger brother, staring at the cracked ceiling of their small one-room home. The man's words echoed in her mind again and again. Your life will not disappear into the shadows. She held the business card close, slipping it beneath her pillow as though it were a secret talisman. For the first time in so long, her heart did not feel weighed entirely by despair. There was something new there. Fragile, trembling, but alive. Hope. The next morning, when she rose for the market, her steps carried a different rhythm. The same mocking voices still greeted her. The same jeers rang out. Look at the orange girl! Still here? Still begging? But something inside her had shifted. Instead of lowering her head in shame, she held her basket with steadier hands. The cruelty still stung, but she did not let it define her. She remembered the man's gaze, steady and unwavering, and for the first time, she dared to believe she was worth more than their insults. Customers still ignored her. Yet she found herself smiling faintly when a child pointed curiously at her fruit. She offered the boy the sweetest orange in her basket for free. His eyes lit up, and he ran back to his mother with joy. Amina felt a flicker of warmth spread in her chest. Kindness, she realized, was not only something she received. It was something she could give, even with so little. That small act changed her day. She began to greet strangers with more courage, speaking louder, her voice steadier. Though she still sold little, she felt a shift, as though the world was finally beginning to notice her, if only in fragments. At home, her younger brother Yusuf noticed too. You're smiling, he said one evening, surprised. Did you sell more today? No, Amina admitted, laughing softly. But I feel lighter. Her brother tilted his head, curious. Amina didn't tell him about the man yet. The card under her pillow felt like a secret, too precious to share. But she knew one thing. Her brother deserved a better life. And perhaps, just perhaps, this man's promise was the path toward it. Over the next week, small changes unfolded. Amina began to rise earlier, arranging her oranges neatly, polishing them until they gleamed. She noticed how presentation mattered, how a brighter smile drew curious glances. Though her earnings remained meager, her confidence grew, and inside her, something else stirred. Determination. She thought of the man's sister, the one he had lost. She did not want to end the same way, forgotten by the world. She wanted her story to be different. Each night, she whispered silent prayers. Not for riches, not even for escape, but for strength. The strength to endure, the courage to hope, and the faith to believe that her life could still bloom. Like an orange tree growing strong against the harshest winds. Unbeknownst to her, the man had not forgotten either. From a distance, he kept watch, asking his driver to pass by the market, ensuring she was safe. He carried his own silent prayers, that this time he would not fail as he had before. Two lives, once strangers, were now bound by invisible threads, one carrying the seeds of transformation, the other carrying the weight of redemption, and together, though they did not yet know it, they were walking toward a future neither could have imagined. For a brief time, Amina felt as though the weight of the world had lifted from her shoulders. The man's kindness, his promise, and the secret card under her pillow gave her courage. Each morning she held her head a little higher. Each evening she allowed herself to imagine a different life. But hope is fragile. And in her town, people were quick to crush anything that dared to rise. One afternoon at the market, as Amina called softly to passers-by, a group of women nearby began to whisper loud enough for her to hear. Did you see that car the other day? Stopped for her, of all people. Another woman laughed harshly. What man of wealth would waste his time on an orange girl? She must have begged him. Or worse. The words sliced through Amina like knives. She turned her face away, pretending not to hear, but the heat of humiliation burned in her cheeks. All around her, eyes seemed to follow. The same people who once ignored her now looked with suspicion, envy, or disdain. Even the children who had mocked her before found new fuel for their cruelty. "Where's your rich boyfriend?" they jeered. "Will he buy your rotten oranges today?" Amina clenched her fists, struggling to stay composed. The man had given her nothing but respect, yet the community twisted it into shame. That night, as she sat beside her mother's bed, she wondered if perhaps they were right. What if he never returned? What if his promises were empty? Had she been foolish to hope? Her mother, weak but perceptive, noticed her silence. "Amina," she whispered, "why do you frown so deeply tonight?" Amina shook her head. "It's nothing, Mama." But in her heart, doubt gnawed at her. Days passed. The black car did not appear. Each morning she searched the road with quiet desperation, but no familiar vehicle slowed. The whispers grew louder. Even neighbors who once ignored her now teased, "So, did he forget you already?" The cruel laughter haunted her. Amina felt the fragile light inside her dim. She began to question everything: his words, his sincerity, even her own worth. Perhaps she truly was destined for nothing more than this roadside corner. One evening, when her oranges had barely sold, she returned home with only a few coins. She stared at her mother's medicine bottle, nearly empty, and panic seized her chest. She pressed her palms to her face, tears spilling between her fingers. "What if this is all I'll ever be?" she whispered into the darkness. For the first time since she'd met him, she considered throwing away the business card. It seemed to mock her now, a cruel reminder of a dream too far to reach. But just as despair threatened to swallow her whole, she remembered the old woman at the market, the one who had bought 2 oranges and said, "You remind me of someone I once loved." That memory steadied her. Not everyone's kindness was false. Not every promise had to break. She clutched the card again, not as proof of salvation, but as a reminder that she was worth more than her suffering. And so, though her doubts lingered like shadows, Amina resolved to endure one more day. She would not let the cruelty of others define her. Even if hope had to flicker faintly, she would keep it alive. Little did she know, the silence of those days was not abandonment. It was the pause before the next chapter of her fate unfolded. The market was unusually crowded that morning. The air buzzed with the chatter of vendors and the clamor of buyers haggling over prices. Amina sat in her usual spot, her basket of oranges in front of her, but her heart was heavy. Days had passed without the return of the mysterious man, and the weight of gossip pressed hard on her spirit. She had just lowered her head, preparing herself for another long day, when the sound of an engine silenced the noise around her. The sleek black car slowed once more, its polished surface gleaming beneath the sun. This time, it did not pass. It stopped. The market froze. Whispers spread like fire. "It's him again! Why here? What does he want with her?" Amina's heart pounded in her chest as the driver stepped out, walked to the passenger's side, and opened the door. From the car emerged the man. Tall, solemn, well-dressed, his presence commanding silence. His eyes searched the crowd before settling on Amina. He walked straight to her, ignoring the stares, and knelt so that his gaze met hers. In the stunned quiet, his voice carried softly but firmly. "I told you I would not forget." Amina's lips trembled. She wanted to speak, but no words came. Around them, the market held its breath. The man glanced at her basket, still nearly full. Without hesitation, he handed her a thick envelope. "This is for you," he said. "For your mother's medicine, for food, for tomorrow and the day after." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Amina opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were stacks of bills, more money than she had ever seen in her life. Her vision blurred with tears, but the murmurs around her grew sharper. "Why her?" someone muttered. "What's so special about the orange girl?" Another scoffed. "He must have his reasons. It's never just kindness." The man rose, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. His jaw tightened, and then he spoke. his voice clear, steady, carrying the weight of truth. "You wonder why I stopped for her? Let me tell you." The market hushed again. "I grew up here," he said, "on these same streets. I too sold fruit, just as she does. People mocked me, spat at me, told me I would never be more than the poor fruit boy. I remember the hunger, the humiliation, the feeling of being invisible. Except when someone wanted to laugh at me." His words struck like thunder. Eyes widened. The whispers faltered. "I left this town with nothing but determination," he continued. "I worked, I failed, I rose again. And now, yes, I have wealth, but I have never forgotten where I came from, or the cruelty I endured here." He turned back to Amina, his expression softening. "When I saw her, I saw myself. I saw the sister I lost, who never escaped the grip of poverty. She died before I could help her, and I swore, if I ever had the chance, I would not let another young life be crushed the way hers was." Amina's tears spilled freely. She pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed. The man looked back at the people, his voice firm. "You mocked her for selling oranges. You laughed at her struggle. But today, I tell you this. She is not the poor orange girl. She is a survivor. And with my help, she will rise." Silence held the market like a spell. The same mouths that had ridiculed Amina now gaped in shame. The man placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You are not invisible, Amina. Your story does not end here. I will sponsor your education, help your family, and guide you toward a future where you no longer sit at this roadside, mocked by those who cannot see your worth." Her sobs broke into shaky laughter. She clutched his hand, unable to form words, but her eyes spoke everything. Gratitude, disbelief, hope. The crowd slowly shifted. Some lowered their gazes in guilt, others looked on with awe. Where once they had seen only a poor orange girl, now they saw a young woman touched by destiny. Amina stood, her knees trembling but her spirit unshaken. For the first time she didn't feel small. She didn't feel worthless. She felt chosen, seen, lifted. And in that moment, beneath the blazing sun and the weight of 100 watching eyes, the girl who once hid behind silence began to rise above the cruelty that had defined her. Her life was no longer measured by the oranges in her basket, but by the promise of tomorrow. The roadside looked different now, or perhaps it was Amina who had changed. Weeks had passed since the day the man had returned and spoken for her in front of the whole market. His promise was not empty. He made sure her mother received proper medicine, that her younger brother had food and clean clothes, and that Amina herself began lessons again. He gave her enough not to feel trapped, but more importantly, he gave her a chance to dream. Yet Amina still walked past the same dusty market each morning. The air was still thick with spice and smoke. Vendors still shouted over one another, and children still darted through the crowd. But now she did not sit with a basket of oranges. She carried books instead, the weight of learning replacing the burden of survival. And still, every time she passed her old spot, her heart tightened with memory. She could almost see her younger self there, tired, dusty, mocked, clutching her basket as if it were her last lifeline. One afternoon, as she crossed the busy street, she noticed a boy no older than 10 sitting quietly on the roadside. In front of him lay a tray of guavas, some bruised, others barely ripe. His shoulders slumped, his clothes torn, his eyes dull with the same exhaustion she once knew too well. Amina slowed. The scene pulled at her heart until she could not walk away. She crouched beside him, just as the man had once done for her. "How much for the guavas?" she asked gently. The boy looked up, startled. "5 rupees, miss." She smiled and reached into her bag, pulling out more than the asking price. She placed the bills into his hand. "I'll take them all," she said. The boy's mouth fell open. His eyes widened with disbelief, just as hers once had. For a moment, she saw herself reflected in his trembling smile, and her chest swelled with emotion. As she lifted the tray into her arms, she leaned closer and whispered, "You are not invisible. Don't ever believe that you are less than anyone else." The boy nodded, tears forming in his wide eyes. Amina stood and walked away, carrying not only guavas, but also the knowledge that kindness did not end with her. It had to be passed on. Later that evening, she sat by her mother's bedside. Her mother, stronger now with medicine and care, reached for her daughter's hand. "You're different, Amina," she murmured. "Your eyes, they shine." Amina smiled, her heart full. "Someone once saw me when no one else did. Now it's my turn to see others." She glanced at the guavas resting on the table and thought of the boy's face. It struck her that compassion was not just a gift she had received. It was a responsibility she now carried. Life had taught her pain, humiliation, and despair. But it had also taught her resilience, dignity, and the power of a single act of kindness to rewrite a person's story. The roadside would always be there, dusty, noisy, unforgiving. But to Amina, it would never again be a place of shame. It was the ground where her suffering had once rooted, but also where her future had begun to bloom. And as the sun dipped low over the town, painting the sky in strokes of gold and crimson, Amina whispered a silent vow to never forget where she came from, and to always carry forward the kindness that had saved her. Because cruelty could break spirits, but compassion could build futures. And in that truth, Amina found her purpose.